So welcome everybody to Not Your Average Princess Fairy Tales Totally Retold. It's a shame we can't be together in person, but at least this way a lot more people can attend. My name is Laura Simeon, and I'm really excited to be here with Kalynn Bayron and Anna-Marie McLemore. So Kailyn is the best-selling author of Cinderella Is Dead. She is a classically trained vocalist, and when she's not writing, you can find her listening to Ella Fitzgerald on loop, attending the theater, watching scary movies, and spending time with her kids. And she currently lives in San Antonio with her family. And her second novel, This Poison Heart, will be out in June. And this is Cinderella Is Dead. So, Anna-Marie was born in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains and was taught by their family to hear La Llorona in the Santa Ana winds. They're the author of The Weight of Feathers, which was a finalist for the 2016 William C. Morris Debut Award, the 2017 Stonewall Honor Book, When the Moon Was Ours, which was longlisted for the National Book Award in Young People's Literature, and winner of the James Tiptree Jr. Award, as well as the author of Wild Beauty, Blanca and Roja, Dark and Deepest Red, and The Mirror Season. And there is The Mirror Season. So just wanted to remind everybody, I'm sure you're aware that the pandemic has been really hard on independent booksellers. So our partner is Nowhere Bookshop, and it's really easy to buy Kailyn and Anna-Marie's books and anything else just by going to the festival website and clicking the Buy the Book button. So I encourage you to do that. Also, you can ask questions in the Q&A box throughout the session. So please drop your questions there as you think of them, and we'll try to fit in as many as we can towards the end. So welcome. Kailyn, Anna-Marie, would you just each take turns saying a few words about your book in case there's somebody here who hasn't read both of them yet? Kailyn, you want to go first?
Sure. So I have Cinderella Is Dead. It came out this past summer. The quick pitch for that is queer Black girls team up to overthrow the patriarchy in the former kingdom of Cinderella. It is a book about a young woman kind of navigating this very heteronormative patriarchal society 200 years after the death of Cinderella. And I also have This Poison Heart, which comes out June 29th. And I have her on the wall back here. And that is the story of 16-year-old Briseis Green, a young woman with a very unique ability. She can grow plants from seeds to full bloom with a single touch. And it is, it's a contemporary YA fantasy about kind of generational curses, and there's a big creepy house, and there's a mysterious garden filled with poison plants, and it is equal parts Little Shop of Horrors, The Secret Garden, and Hades Town. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Anna-Marie. My pronouns are they, them, and I write queer, Latinx, non-binary fairy tales. My most recent one is The Mirror Season, which is a book about two sexual assault survivors who find their fates intertwined during a season of vanishing trees and enchanted mirrors and magic. Fandolce, which was one of my favorite parts of this book to write about, because I love writing about traditions passed down through families, and a lot of those are food. And for Sierra, a big part of the healing process and a big part of the process of showing love to her community is making pan dulce. So this is probably in terms of reimaginings, this is probably one that was most like gently and lightly inspired by a fairy tale, because it was originally inspired by the Snow Queen, and threads of the Snow Queen are woven throughout this story, because I really wanted to ask the question of why do we take at face value this character as a villain? Why do we not ask what her story was? And that was something that kept coming back to me during writing about a queer Latina survivor finding her voice and finding her strength.
Yeah, and one thing that really struck me about both your books and, thinking about the origins, the stories that they're sort of inspired by, is how often, people talk about like fairy tale, fairy tale wedding or whatever, is this kind of sweetness and light. But when you look at the original stories, they're raw, they're viscerally powerful. They speak to all sides of human nature, just like your books. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, why and how those tales inspired your stories. Anna Marie, do you want to go first?
Sure. So there's a lot that's brutal in fairy tales, and a lot of that is because fairy tales across different traditions, there there are fairy tales, and this is something I always want to talk about. Like, there are fairy tales in every tradition, no matter like what the very like white straight versions of them that we are familiar with. They are in every tradition, and part of that is the beauty and the kindness and of human nature, and also the cruelty of people. And part of that shows up in fairy tales a lot, whether that's actually in the story itself or whether it's in this sort of morality tale of what fairy tales end up being. I thought about that a lot with this book, with Dark and Deepest Red, because it's about the red shoes. And that's, if ever there was a morality tale, it's basically like, don't be too into yourself, or something terrible could happen, like these like red shoes could dance you to death. So even that itself is this brutal plot element, and it's also what the story is telling you. Like, the message it's giving you is a little heartbreaking, especially if you're growing up, being a certain kind of girl, or for me, like a certain kind of gender confused person, quite frankly, as I was growing up. Like, you don't always know what to do with that. And in the mirror season, when I was writing about the Snow Queen, there's a lot of just hard stuff in this fairy tale. Like, the Snow Queen is a beautiful story. Like it's glittery. There are snow palaces. There are like snow roses. There are all of that. But there's an enchanted mirror that just makes you like see the worst of the world. There's this frozen landscape where you're basically alone, like whether you're considered the hero or the villain in the story. So the idea of enchanted mirrors that sort of change how you see the world, that became something I wrote about literally in Mirror Season, and also something I wrote about in a more metaphorical sense of how you carry trauma and how that changes your view of the world and what you do with it and how you go forward.
Yeah, so I think that those kind of gritty elements are my favorite parts of those stories because they feel the most human. And those are the parts that really, I think, pull you into those stories. And I think that sometimes it allows you to kind of see these stories for what they are, because sometimes they can be these cautionary tales. It's kind of a warning. I think that the violence that is present is almost always tied to those kind of warnings that, if you're not pretty enough to catch the eye of the prince, you might need to excise the thing that kind of sets you apart and doesn't allow you to fit in. And in the case of the stepsisters with Cinderella, it's like a literal part of your body. They're cutting off their parts of their feet to fit into the shoe in order to kind of win him over. And so it's, I think, what kind of message does that send? You have to kind of punish yourself in order to fit in order to to win the prince. And it's kind of like, you mind your manners, obey your father, marry a prince, live happily ever after. It's such an insidiously wicked kind of tale, that saying those things to people. And a lot of times we're introduced to these stories when we're kids. So we're getting these messages at such a young age. I think that it really, stories have the ability to kind of help us understand where we fit in and ultimately who we become, what we believe in. And so when we are hearing these kinds of messages, I think it can be damaging, hugely damaging. And so looking at retellings, for me, I think it's about kind of taking those parts of the story that feel very oppressive, and deconstructing them, taking them apart, taking them down to the bare bones. What are these messages saying? They're kind of they're propping up patriarchy. They're propping up the subjugation of women and girls, and they are erasing queer people almost entirely. So I think it's kind of about undoing a lot of unlearning, undoing a lot of the messages that are deeply entrenched in those stories.
I want to avoid any spoilers, but what each of you said made me think about how much both your novels they center around the power of stories. Sophia and Constance are kind of literally searching for a story, an origin story. Ciela and Locke, they're kind of trapped by these stories, like what each of them knows and what the bullies know. And it's the power, like the stories that we hear and we internalize, and then the power, how we can be freed and transformed when we reject them, we flip the narrative. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Like, did you consciously approach that theme? Did it kind of emerge as you were writing? Did you, set out to kind of grapple with the role of stories in our lives? Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah. So I think that stories definitely can be a way to escape, to kind of reimagine what's possible. That's the kind of inherent power of storytelling, but it allows us to imagine so many different possibilities for ourselves and the world around us, but they also have the ability to cause harm. And fairy tales are this kind of perfect example, I think. It's like when we talk about fairy tales and their ability to be transformative, I get a lot of pushback sometimes when I talk about this, because people look at fairy tales as kids' stories. It's not that big a deal. It's not that deep. And my kind of response to that is that you're wrong. They do have the power to kind of shape how we see the world and our place in it. And the white, straight, cis media that we're inundated with from the time we're kids really bolsters the myth of white supremacy, of heteronormativity, of binary gender and gender roles. These are, conscious decisions being made here with these stories. And, they didn't forget us. We were excluded. And so, I think to kind of, circle back to something a little more positive, I think that creatives are continuing to press for better representation. We have books with Black main characters and LGBTQ leads, and sometimes both at the same time, which is great because we need that intersectionality. And it's, we don't often see that. So often we have to be one thing. And I just think that having these intersections of marginalized race, gender, and sexuality being shown on the page, it feels really powerful. And so I think that that's the power of storytelling. What you do with it, there's so many possibilities. There's so many avenues. And there are so many readers who have not had a chance to see themselves reflected. And we have this opportunity here to kind of give them something that they really have been hungry for. And those portrayals can be nuanced. We don't have to the LGBTQ community is not a monolith. We are vast and varied, and there's so much of an opportunity there. And so I'm hopeful that we're getting to a point where that can be, because it's been an uphill climb. It's been an uphill battle to have these stories out, get put out and get the support that they need to be successful and to reach the readers, which is the most important thing. So I'm hopeful. But stories do have the power to change our perception of the world around us, and that's a very important tool that we have as authors.
So I think the book where I first started really thinking about this question of like how do the stories that we're told and the stories that we internalize and tell ourselves affect us was with Blanca y Roja, this book, which was a queer Latinx reimagining of Snow White and Rose Red meet Swan Lake, which are both stories in which you are told what kind of woman you are, what kind of girl you are. These are your options. So in Blanca y Roja, you have these two sisters who, partially based on temperament, but mostly based on colorism, are told you are this kind of girl or you are this kind of girl. So, and they take that on board in a way that they start to not even notice it anymore. And that's something that becomes so insidious about the stories that we can take on board. Like even if they're pretty, even if they're fairy tales, sometimes they can tell us really awful things about ourselves that aren't true. And part of what I wrote in Blanca y Roja is them sort of reclaiming that and deciding what is the story that we're going to write for ourselves. And that it also gave me a chance to pick apart other parts of Snow White and Rose Red, which is a story I loved growing up because I loved that it was a sister story, but there were also things about it that bothered me, like the sort of the colorism that was never talked about, the fact that you have this character at the end, the Bear Prince's brother, who you've never heard of before, who just shows up and is basically there to like marry Rose Red, who's never met him before. I got to make that character a non-binary character who uses alternating pronouns. So I like being able to take some of that stuff apart because it should be taken apart. And when I was writing these threads about the Snow Queen in the Mirror season, the Snow Queen was another story that I loved growing up, but I also had a really complicated relationship with the Snow Queen because like you have your option as a brown girl reading that story is you get one character, and she's a frightening character. She's like placed there as a villain who ultimately becomes an ally, but doesn't like she's there to do what the story needs her to do. And that's I think often how like you can feel as a marginalized reader. Like you're there to serve the story and you're there to be whatever kind of villain or side character is necessary. So writing these stories where queer characters, where characters of color, where trans and non-binary characters become the center, that's an act of empowerment to me, and it's where we belong. We belong at the center of stories as much as we've been put sort of to the like either left out of them, either excluded from them entirely or placed as villains. Like we belong at the center of them. That's where we should be.
Thank you. Anna Maria, I have to apologize. Bullies is not nearly a strong enough word in my zeal to avoid spoilers. Anyway, people who read the book will understand the dynamic there. So yeah, things both of you said, with colorism and, being at the center of stories and deconstructing these harmful messages. One of my personal pet peeves is when people say, oh, we've seen that story before. Because yes, fairy tale adaptations, they have been popular for a while, but not with queer kids at the center and brown and black kids at the center. They've been told, through this very kind of dominant culture lens for a long time. And so it seems like, when is our turn to be the stars and to change the narrative? Because who is in the story? It changes the questions the story asks. It changes, which readers resonate and see their reflections. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. I don't, if you've heard these comments, or I'm sure you've had them directed at you or at other people, what your thoughts are. Anna Marie, do you want to go first?
Well, I think some conversations that have happened, rightfully, mention the fact that most stories in some way have been done before, and that's part of why they resonate with us. That's part of why fairy tales across different traditions resonate with us, and why you'll see different themes coming up over and over. But I think something that especially bothers me, and I know bothers a lot of a lot of other readers that I talk with, is that it it hasn't been done before if it's left out entire communities. Like if it's centered only in particular communities, like it hasn't really been done before. Those doors haven't been opened. So we love certain kinds of stories because they resonate with us. And because they resonate with us as human beings, they need to reflect like who we are as human beings, instead of the kind of like, especially when you're talking about fairy tales, if you close that world to what a lot of us see growing up, you're gonna that's the standard that you're gonna continue to be held to. And that's part of what's so toxic, like growing up. Like I was fortunate enough to like be exposed to fairy tales from my own traditions also. Most of the ones I saw in mainstream media, it was like you need to be this like particular kind of person. You need to be this cis straight white blonde person to be valuable. So being able to write stories that challenge that is something that means a lot to me as an author, and it's something that means a lot to me as a reader, to be able to encounter those books that it's, for me, it's an act of advocacy and activism to write those books, and to find those books that I would have wanted is an act of healing, to be able to read them as a reader.
Yeah, I did, I think, when I was querying with Cinderella Is Dead, that was the point in my kind of like publishing journey where I kind of realized that there was this blind spot. It was a kind of a agents were telling me like this story has been done. Cinderella retellings have been redone, and we don't, the market is oversaturated. And I was like, where is the story that centers a queer Black girl? And there, it was very telling that if the story didn't, that my story didn't center a white straight character. And I was being told that, it was being treated like it was a part of that when it wasn't. It really was just a completely different story. And so I think that, when I think back on myself as a young reader, what I would have wanted to see was someone who looked like me, or someone who was feeling the types of things that I was feeling. And I think we all want that, right? Like we all want to see, some little part of ourselves in the stories that we read sometimes, especially with fairy tales, because because they're such a huge part of our lives, whether, purposely or just by the fact that they're everywhere. I grew up in, the 80s and 90s, and Disney princesses were at their peak, popularity. And I just, remember feeling like that wasn't for me. I wanted it to be, but it was very clear that it wasn't for me. And so I think that, I think that we're going to continue to have this conversation about things being done or dead or, overdone. Right when you see a bunch of, queer, Black, Indigenous people of color kind of, dipping their toe in the pool, it's like, as soon as we're there, all of a sudden it's too much. It's over. It's, we're moving on to other things. We're going to continue to have this conversation about letting us have a chance to do these things in a way that is completely new and feels fresh, because it's not just painting the roses red. It's not just Cinderella, but she happens to be Black. The whole entire dynamic of the story changes when you have characters of color and queer characters at the center. It changes the entire dynamic of the story. And so it hasn't been overdone, and it won't be. We all need to have a turn. We all need to be able to write these books that we as young readers wanted to see, and that I know for a fact that readers out there right now need more of. And so, yeah, it's, retellings, I don't think retellings for me never get old, because, you can give 10 writers a Cinderella story and ask them to redo it and you'll get 10 different stories. So I love retellings, and I love seeing the more, they're just so inclusive now. And I really enjoy seeing that.
I'd actually love to know, and Kailyn, I know it's difficult because your debut appeared in the middle of a pandemic, but I'd love to know what responses you've gotten from readers, because you're speaking to so many readers of all ages who have not had their, seen themselves in these stories before. Would you share just some of the responses you've gotten?
Yeah, so I get emails, I get letters, like I have like physical letters that people are like writing, and I think that the main thing that I hear is, um, I just wanted to see someone who was queer and got to live to the end and have a love interest in the end and find it seems so simple, right? Like that you have a story that, where the queer characters survive and are happy at the end. That is it's a radical act. And that is the thing that I think I hear the most from readers when they reach out to me. It's kind of like, I was just really happy to see people kind of getting a happily ever after, because sometimes we're not allowed to have that in these stories. And so, but it runs, the gamut of experiences. I have people tell me that Cinderella Is Dead, they read it with their mom and it helped them come out to their mom, or their other family members. I've had people tell me that they realized that their kid was queer while reading this book, and it's like it opens up a conversation. And even if you don't identify or share those the identities of my characters, people around you do, and even if you don't know it yet. And so I think it's just been so kind of moving to be able to hear these experiences from readers. And I every time I get a letter or an email kind of highlighting that, I just feel honored. I feel honored to be able to write these stories and give people another option and another choice and a different kind of story. And I just feel really lucky.
Okay. Anna Marie, how about you?
So the mirror season came out really recently, and the messages I get are they mean a lot to me, and they're also heartbreaking often, because they're from fellow survivors who I knew were often readers who were going to be seeking out this book. And I wanted to make sure that I took care of them in this story that was going to be hard for them to read, or hard for anyone who cares about them. I know that some of the messages I get are from people who are close to survivors and want to understand what this process of going forward from trauma is like, and what it might look like. Something I also really appreciate is hearing from readers, especially readers who are survivors, that they're laughing while they're reading this. Like the humor in this book is making them laugh, and that's part of what was important to me in taking care of readers in this book. Is this idea of when you are around people who understand what you've been through, whether that's people in your community, people who share your identity, if you're a survivor, fellow survivors, there's a safe space that can be created, and that's often a space where you learn to laugh again. So the fact that readers who had this book grab them by the heart were also laughing during it, that's something that meant a lot to me, because this is a book that had to have humor in it. It had to be able to like tell this kind of story, and often and also because that's how we survive. Is learning to find the joy and the laughter and the magic. And I think the other message that I get a lot about my books, especially about when we're talking about retellings, especially Blanqui y Roja, is readers who are just starting to think about their gender identity and who read page and think, I think I might be trans, or I think I might be non-binary, and that's overwhelming to me, and I'm honored to be a small part of that journey. And I'm grateful to be able to tell them that, like, it takes the time that it takes to figure it out, and like no one should ever feel like they're slow in figuring this out. Like I'm kind of a testament to this. I wrote 4 books about trans and non-binary characters before, like, thinking like, oh yeah, like maybe that's what was going on when I was growing up. Maybe that's what's still going on. So I'm honored that my books can be like a small part of anyone's identity journey, and I'm glad to be able to like remind people that our identities are a work in progress. Who we are is a work in progress, and whatever time that takes, it takes. And no matter what time that takes, your identity and who you are is beautiful.
I love that. That element of joy is so important, getting to survive and do more than survive and thrive as well. Have your happy endings. Each of you said something that kind of reminded me that there's a thread I saw in both books where it's ironic that sometimes, the people who are most harmed by rigid messages from society around gender norms are often the ones who are most eager to kind of enforce them on others. And then at the same time, the people who are privileged often don't see how those same norms, yes, they give them privilege, but they also harm them, and we're all hemmed in by restrictions and rules and so on. And I saw all your characters grappling with these things, and sort of pushing, like trying to break free, but kind of being pulled back by others. Could you just talk to that element a little bit? I don't know if I'm being too vague, but I saw it as this really common thread between the 2 novels.
So in Cinderella Is Dead, gender norms are reinforced by the way I have it set up is that the gender norms in this society are set up by the Cinderella story itself. In Cinderella Is Dead, there's this idea that in this society, a woman's place is in service to her father and then to her husband. And it assumes that all women want to be with a man. It also assumes that all men want a wife, and it erases anyone who doesn't fall into that system. The roles are clearly defined, and the thing that I wanted to really highlight was that everyone suffers because of it. It's, parents, kind of like Sophia's parents, are they see her becoming something that society has deemed to be an outlier, and their fear for her safety is very real. And so they pressure her into playing this role. They know exactly who she is, but they are telling her, you cannot act on that. You cannot be that. You have to pretend to be something else. They know she's pretending. They know that it's not genuine for her. They don't care. They say that in order for us to survive, this is what we have to do. And I think that that's a very relatable kind of experience. I think a lot of us stay in situations that are not, good for us, not good for our mental health, because we're just trying to survive. We are trying to stay safe, even though we're not safe. We're extremely vulnerable. But I think that's kind of the irony of it is, with Sophia, her parents really think they're doing the right thing. They think that this is going to keep her safe. But then I took steps to illustrate how not only will Sophia not be safe by conforming to these societal expectations, she and other people like her will be more vulnerable. They will be more of a target. And they will not be okay. And I think that's kind of the thing. It's, you know, her parents wanting to kind of protect her, and they end up doing the opposite. And so I think also with Aaron and with Luke and Constance, you know, I think that all of these people have suffered under these rules, and they all took a different path to figure out how to survive. And Aaron kind of conforms and suffers, and Luke, you know, kind of has to stay quiet, and he ends up suffering, and Constance pushes back and she suffers as well. But it's kind of like, I think it just goes to show that under this system, everyone is harmed. And the system is working exactly as it was meant to. The people who put it in place understand that it is harmful, and that, you know, there's no thought given to that, given to people's safety, to people's fears. And so it's really about shining a light on that and showing that these kind of societal expectations don't benefit anyone who, you know, who really cares about other people and their family and their friends and their kids and their parents and, you know, their community. It's so damaging. And I tried really hard to illustrate that. And it was, you know, that means kind of getting into the weeds about it, getting, you know, showing all these different things, all these different ways that people are harmed. But, you know, ultimately, I think it's a story about kind of knowing who you are and asking society to meet you where you're at, which sometimes is a very tough path to follow.
So I thought about these ideas of gender norms a lot when I was writing this book, especially writing about two very different survivors, writing about a queer Latina survivor and writing about a survivor who's a boy. Is they both handle trauma in very different ways. When I think about Locke, who's a survivor who's a boy, he, because of like bad information he's been given growing up, incomplete information he's been given growing up, when he's assaulted, he kind of like he intellectually knows that he's not like the only one it's ever happened to, but because of what he he thinks he doesn't know anyone else, he kind of feels like that, and he ends up like taking in all of that. Like this is a horrible example of, and it happens all the time, of how toxic masculinity like hurts everybody. Like it's this guy who normally is not like does not go in for the toxic masculinity stuff is suddenly gets in this place of this, like, this was my fault, because however much he's an ally to other survivors, when it comes to himself, he's very like, because I'm a guy, this was my fault. Because I wasn't strong enough, because of all of these lies that he's sort of internalized growing up. And with and he doesn't really get out of that until he like is in a situation of talking to like other guys who are survivors, and knowing that like, no, this happens to other people. This happens to other people that I know and care about and respect, and that means I can also care about and respect myself, no matter what's happened to me. And with Ciela, there's so much that gets wrapped up in like in her intersectional identity, like the fact that she's queer, the fact that she's Latina, the fact that she's mixed race, and the way that certain people around her, like especially like the white people at her school, are going to assume certain things about her. They're going to decide who she is, like based on her identity, like based on her body. Whatever they're going to assume, and she has to like push back against that. And this comes in a lot related to her pansexual identity. because your identity gets like trauma, whatever it is, whatever trauma looks like, it often shakes up your identity, and it often makes you feel detached from it in a way that you have to come back to, in a way that you have to reclaim. So this idea that this concept of pansexuality, that like is very, like it's very easy for her to understand, like her best, like her best friend is her ex-girlfriend, her, who's a lesbian, who understands all of this, like who gets all of this, but a lot of the people around her don't get this. So it's important for her to be like, this is how I understand myself, this is how I understand my identity, this is how I understand gender. And it does matter how other people understand it, because it affects me, but their lack of understanding doesn't change my understanding of myself.
That's great. And I think the books take the message to the next level, because sometimes I read books and it feels like it's being framed as, look at these poor people who are victims, as opposed to, we're all connected and we're all affected to varying degrees by these kinds of messages that, they close down opportunities, they build walls between people. But thank you. I'd love to switch gears a little, talk about setting, because setting was a really strong element in both books. And the bakery, I mean, it was such a great sensory, experience. And, the woods outside, well, Marseille, but then especially the woods that have this kind of horror sort of feel to them. And I'd love to hear just like how you settled on the locations for your books and those elements. Did you consider other possibilities? Did you do any particular research? Who would like to go first?
I'll jump in. I love fairy tales as a kid, and I had in my mind this very kind of specific place. And I think a lot of it is inspired by the French telling of Cinderella, and that is the version where we see the fairy godmother for the first time and the glass slippers for the first time. Those elements aren't involved in earlier versions of the story. But that particular version, which the Disney version is, heavily influenced by, that's the one that stuck out for me. And, as much as these fairy tales kind of, I love the fairy tales, but they didn't really love me back. As much as it feels like that, I still have a lot of nostalgia for fairy tales and for that kind of magical setting. So I wanted this very kind of historical feel for Cinderella Is Dead, and a setting that felt similar to the French version of Cinderella. And I think that's why I have some of those influences there, especially with the names and the capital city, and those are all inspired by that. But I think that also I love scary stories, and so I really wanted to have this element of fear, and I think that that's where the Whitewood comes in. It's this very scary place, and then also the palace is also this glittering kind of facade, but it is Sophia instantly kind of recognizes it as a nightmare, as something that, this is what it looks like on the outside, but once we get in there, this is going to go south fast. And so I really just love all of those little nods to the earlier kind of versions of this story, and because I pulled from a lot of different places for it, not just one version. And so the setting for me is just kind of an ode to my love of those kind of classic fairy tales.
So thinking about setting, definitely the Bastaria Panaderia was a big part of this, just because it's the center of this family. And in a way, it's one of the centers of this community. It's a place where people gather. It's a place where people come to get bundles, say, for church events. It's where they come get bolillos for parties they're gonna have. So having it be a community center and having it also be a family center, like this is a family business. These are family recipes. This is a sort of tradition that's been passed down and shared. And Ciela, I won't give spoilers on this, since this is one of the plot threads, but Ciela has a particular gift related to Pan Dulce. And that's something that becomes important in terms of reclaiming herself. And it's also just this idea of inheritance. What do you pass down from generation to generation, no matter how, like, what the world decides about you, no matter what the world decides about your family or your community, you have these things that are for you, that are for your family, and that are for your community. And like everybody comes into the pasteleria. So it's kind of like there's tourists, there's people in the community, there's people all over the town that come into the pasteleria, but there's also sort of this language that is spoken in this community, and that's spoken within it, and with people that this community trusts. So having these common reference points that sort of gets translated into this language of flour and sugar and yeast, that was something that was really important to me, especially because I don't think I've really talked about this before with this book, but I wanted to set this book in San Juan Capistrano because of the swallows, because of the sort of complicated relationship that the swallows have with this landscape that's been built up and that's been artificially cultivated, and that's been changed so much that they kind of don't have a habitat anymore. And if you think I'm talking about colonization, I absolutely am, and that's part of why I didn't center the mission in this book. And that probably makes some people mad that I'm writing about San Juan Capistrano, and I'm not really writing about the mission. Like, I don't even know if I mention it. If I mention it, I think it's like in directions somewhere, just because I didn't want to have that be the center of the landscape, because it was like it was complicated, like growing up in California, like having the missions like elevated as like something to be celebrated, especially being a kid who grew up being religious. Like, I'm still religious. I now go to a church with a big rainbow flag in front, which I'm very grateful for, but being religious and being like a mixed race kid, and knowing like what the history was, and where you sort of fit into, like, where my ancestors sort of fit into that history, and where they were considered not to fit, and how something so often it was decided that something needed to be changed about us for us to be good and holy and embraced by God. Like, it was heartbreaking. And so, not like having that be the center of my San Juan Capistrano, that was something that was very intentional. I kind of it just doesn't get a lot of space in the book, because I want to talk about the swallows. I want to talk about like other reference points in this landscape. I want to talk about like features of the Southern California landscape that were there and have been there and will continue to be there. So it was setting for me in this book was about much like baking, it's about what I put in and what I left out. So those were choices that I made early on, like as I was thinking about like what my San Juan Capistrano was going to be, at the same time that I was trying to like learn to make pan dulce, because that was the one that I bake a lot, and that was the one thing I had to like the one family recipe I had to like really learn to be able to do this book. So that was kind of what I was thinking about while I was baking.
I love that. I know it made me want to go in the kitchen and they're whipping things up. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we have some great questions coming in. So I thought I would just read, let's see. So we've got one from Maricela Chavez, asks, can you speak about the challenges of considering your audience as part of your storytelling style? How do you, as Toni Morrison was committed to doing, Give your speakers the agency to talk freely about their world without supplying a bunch of cultural context or quote unquote translation for unfamiliar readers. Whoever would like
You
to
know,
jump in.
that's something that I struggled with, to be honest. Because I think that sometimes, I internalized this kind of thinking that my audience would be a specific type of person or a specific type of reader. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm talking about, this more so with, I think with This Poison Heart, because it's a contemporary. And so, I'm talking about, Briseis it's her wash day, and she's gonna twist up her hair, and she's gonna do all these things, and that I know what they mean, and I know that my readers will know what she means, but maybe there are people who don't, and I had to really get comfortable with just saying, no, this is okay for me to write this just the way it is, because I've been reading books that censor white people my entire life, and I figured it out. You know what I mean? There are things that aren't necessarily familiar to me. I figured it out. I think that, I trust the readers to be able to kind of figure it out. I think that sometimes, you know, I, I think that I just can't write a genuine, character, someone that I believe in, if I'm constantly trying to make sure that everybody gets it, everybody understands. You know what I mean? I do keep my readers in mind. In the later drafts, in the very beginning when I'm drafting, it's just for me. It's for me and for what, the story that I really want to tell. And then later on, I start to think about, readers are going to be reading this and looking at this, and how does this kind of come across? And, those things I kind of all, take that into consideration. But I don't feel the need to explain certain kind of cultural experiences anymore. And I think that is something that I've had to get comfortable with, but I'm pretty comfortable with it now. So, I trust the reader to figure it out, and I think they'll be all right.
Yeah, a lot of that resonates with me. It's still a process though. Like I think about this with everything, like whether it's with putting Spanish in my books. Like my debut, the Spanish was italicized because I thought I was being a good author. I thought that's what I had to do. Um, and I'm still sort of like it's like I'm kind of a work in progress in that respect because I want to make my work accessible, especially as I think about my own history, like being dyslexic. Like there are like Spanish words I heard all the time growing up, and it took me like forever to know what they were spelled like because I heard them and I didn't see them. Or if I saw them, I wasn't matching them. I won't go too much in the weeds about dyslexia there, in terms of the matching that's involved there. But I want what I write to be accessible without feeling like I have to over explain it or like make sure that some kind of dictionary definition of every Spanish word that I use is in there. So kind of trying to find that middle ground, and for it being okay for some things to be inferred for what a reader is going to get to be close enough. Because I found that like the readers that I've heard from, whether these are their reference points or not, they like being immersed in this world. Like it's like talking to a friend. And if you have a friend who's talking about like what they love, you're gonna fall into that world. And some of that happens with gender too. Like how much do I explain with non-binary gender, with transgender identity? Because I want to help readers who don't understand, but I also want it to be a safe space for trans and non-binary readers, and the people who love them to just like be able to experience the story.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Erica Murray wants to know, what were your favorite books as teens, and is there a book you've read before your own that you truly felt seen or represented in as a child or as an adult?
Um, so as a teen reader, as a younger reader, I read a lot of adult fiction because that's what I had access to. So I read a lot of Stephen King. I read a lot of Anne Rice. Like I said, I'm a huge like horror novel fan, and so I read, a lot of things that maybe I should have waited just a little bit longer, but whatever. It's that's what I had access to, so that's what I read. I did not find my whole self um, in a novel at that time. I found pieces of myself, especially in Toni Morrison's work, in Zora Neale Hurston's work. I found pieces of myself there, but I still don't know. I still don't know if I've completely found that yet. I think maybe it's okay to kind of be able to see yourself in different aspects of different characters and kind of have that be the experience. So I don't know. I try not to put like too much of myself in a character. Like Briseis is not me and Sophia is not me, but we have similarities, and so I'm still looking, I guess. I'm still, discovering new things about, who I am and different aspects of who I am and my identity all the time. And so I, haven't seen that fully represented, but, there's still time, and I've found pieces of myself in different work.
Yeah, I wonder if for those of us who grew up not like seeing ourselves reflected very often, I kind of wonder if that's like, sort of like a long-term, lifelong process of like finding pieces of ourselves and finding the books that like that at least for me it kind of feels like it like the bookshelf I would have wanted and that I'm glad to be able to share with other people now. So thinking about growing up, like the books that I found pieces of myself in were probably like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel, um, Passing by Nella Larson. And then when I think about like when I started reading YA, like it wasn't exactly like all of my identity, but like Ash by Melinda Lowe was a really like talking about retellings. That was a really big book for me. Like, oh, like there are queer writers of color and they are writing fairy tales. Like that will always be a transformative book for me.
We might have time to squeeze in one more. So Deborah Castanon says, this has been a wonderful and important conversation. Where do you feel that the fairy tales of old belong in the experience of young children today? It's a big question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I think we've seen a lot of conversations lately about, the classics and where they fit in and how do we, I think that those stories aren't going anywhere. They will remain. I think what I would like to focus on more is adding to the stories that are available to young readers. I think that if they have other options, if they're reading Cinderella and they love Cinderella, well, you can pick up Cinderella Is Dead, you can pick up Ash, you can pick up, all of these different kinds of versions of Cinderella, and maybe find something else that resonates. I think it's more just about giving young readers more options, more choices. And so I think those older fairy tales, those will always be here. They will always be around. They're not going anywhere. But I feel like it's a good thing that we have more options now, more titles to choose from. That's what it comes down to for me.
Yeah, I'll echo that, especially because I think the more we can sort of highlight the fact that these fairy tales we see, they have different resonances across different traditions and different cultures. I think that's really important, and I'd love to see more of that.
I think we can only be enriched by adding to the variety of stories we have out there. So, quick reminder, we're almost out of time. These are the wonderful books by our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. Please head over to Nowhere Bookshop, buy these books, support our authors, support our bookshop partner, And thank you so much for being here today. We got some great questions and great comments. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to everything